Hello comrades, welcome to Soviet Journey channel. In this video, I will tell you about the history of rock music in the Soviet Union, its origins, development and the situation until its dissolution. This subject is generally little known or incorrectly known. Many biased articles mention that rock music was banned in the Soviet Union, that it was subject to many persecutions, or that the Soviet government was very repressive towards music. Friends, all of these are lies. They are Cold War bullshits. Rock music was very much present in the Soviet music, and it was very popular. Let's take a look at how it has developed. Yes, comrades. First of all, let's talk about a little history of rock music. As is known, this genre, which emerged under the name of rock music under the influence of blues, jazz, and country music, was born in the USA in the 1950s and grew into different styles in many parts of the world in the 1960s. With the influence of the use of radio and television culture as a means of influencing other countries in the Western world, led by the USA, rock music spread rapidly throughout the world from its early days and became a style of music that most of us still enjoy listening to. The recognition of this new musical genre in the Soviet Union, as in other countries, corresponded to the 1960s. The proliferation of rock music in the Soviet Union experienced its golden age in the 1980s with the official release of recordings by Soviet underground bands. The 1980s are remembered all over the world as the golden age of rock music, and the same was true in the Soviet Union. Now let's examine together how rock music has developed over the years since its birth in the Soviet Union. The 1960s were the years when Soviet youth met rock music for the first time. Previously, in 1957, the World Youth and Student Festival was held in Moscow with the participation of tens of thousands of young people from many countries of the world, and many musical genres from the Soviet Union were performed at this festival. At this event, concerts were held using many instruments, including electric guitars. Many musical instruments used in those years formed the basis of the musical instruments used today. Then the world-famous rock music groups Beatles, Deep Purple and the Rolling Stones became the groups that rapidly increased the popularity of rock music among Soviet youth in the early 1960s. In its early days, Komsomol, the youth organization of the Communist Party, organized rock music events in many factories. During this period, a large number of rock bands appeared not only in Russia, but also in other Soviet republics. These bands often used their own personal equipment and sound systems to convert acoustic guitars into electric guitars, as musical equipment was not readily available at the time. High-end quality equipment was available on the black market and in Western countries, but due to its prohibitive prices, most bands used their own resources to produce their music. By 1966, there were over 250 rock bands in Moscow alone. In the mid-1960s, groups performing cover versions of foreign hits began to form in Moscow and Leningrad. Among the oldest music bands were bands called Sokol, Scythians, Sokomoroki and Slavyan. After the bands became more popular, many schools started to form their own small rock groups. Many of these groups would later become central figures in the 1970s scene. For example, Rubenovaya Radikar, Dakno Priobretny and Machine of Rumeni groups can be given as examples. The first major mass event of Soviet rock music was the Yerevan Festival, which brought together Moscow's biggest bands and was held annually from 1968 to 1972. Many rock bands have performed here and introduced rock music to the masses. After that, nothing was the same again. Rock music was now well known among young people. In short, the 1960s were the years when rock music began to grow slowly in the Soviet Union, as in many countries around the world. One of the most important factors that enabled the development of rock music in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in the 1970s was the original songs written by many rock music composers in their own mother tongue. For example, groups that composed songs in their native language, such as Illies in the Hungarian People's Republic, PPU short for Plastic Universe People in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, or Machine of Romani in Soviet Russia, emerged during this period. Known as the Beatles of the Kazakhs and popular in the 1970s, Duz Mukasan combines traditional Kazakh songs with guitar. Or, for another example, the Kyrgyz Narista group became famous through festivals in various regions of the Soviet Union. The Turkmenistan origin Goons band combined jazz and rock music with traditional music and gave concerts in many countries. The Koma Wetin band, which performs Kurdish rock music in Georgia, has held many events with the support of the state and the Communist Party. Unlike similar attempts by other bands in the 1960s, most rock bands of the 1970s managed to maintain a stable presence despite existing in the underground market, meaning non-mainstream music market. In the mainstream music market, there were rock music groups called VIA, the Russian abbreviation for Vocal Instrument Ensemble, whose lyrics were approved by Soviet authorities and whose technical infrastructure made music of much higher quality than the underground groups. The VIA groups, which were in solidarity with the Union of Soviet Composers, generally dealt with topics that were popular in the Soviet period, such as steel production, grain harvest, anti-fascist solidarity, and the importance of labor. Examples of these groups include Rezvali Rebyata, which means funny kids, Shivity, which means flowers, and Golubai Gitari, which means blue guitars. VIA groups were as popular among Soviet youth as rock groups in the West because famous rock stars of the 1960s had become well known in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. VIA groups wrote many songs about workers all over the world during these years, and these songs were sung by many groups. During this period, these groups also performed covers of Beatles songs, providing enthusiastic moments to the audience at concerts. Some VIA groups were only covering songs by famous Western rock bands. That is, they did not sing local songs because they had to pay royalties to the Union of Soviet Composers for each performance of a song whose lyrics and music belonged to another Soviet group. This was not the case when cover versions of foreign artists' songs were sung. That's why there was a significant increase in the number of cover songs during this period. Some groups chose to be counted as amateur musicians rather than as VIA. In this case, bands could not release official records, but since rock bands were generally university students, they could find the time and give live concerts in many different places. During this period, songs and concert recordings were distributed, not in albums but in unofficial publications called samizdat, often with the aid of a tape recorder. As these recordings increased, house concerts began to become widespread, especially in the late 1970s. Many bands based in Moscow followed this method, and house concerts became very common in the 1980s. Leningrad rock bands of the 1970s, such as Miffy meaning epic, Rossiyan meaning Russian people, The Saint, Petersburg Group, and Zemlyan meaning earthlings, also performed with only electric guitars. According to the musical perception of that period, acoustic songs were no longer suitable for rock music and acoustic performances had become meaningless. The bands of the 1970s generally started to make songs in the styles of heavy metal, hard rock, and progressive rock. During this period, rock music fans in the Soviet Union gradually started to turn to and listen to the bands that gave unrecorded concerts rather than the VIA bands. By the end of the 1970s, Soviet rock music was getting better and beginning to take shape. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a full-fledged rock movement emerged in the Soviet Union, which began to organize itself without the help of official organizations. In order to bring together this rock movement, which had not previously existed under one roof, the Leningrad Rock Club, the first rock club in the Soviet Union, was opened in 1981. Thanks to these legal rock clubs, music groups were able to record and perform legally for the first time, and thus the authorities were able to see and support musical events outside of VIA groups. Of course, it was not possible in the Soviet Union to release albums through private companies, as in the capitalist culture of the West. Soviet bands would record their albums themselves and distribute copies to the public through organizations. Increasingly, albums recorded in the 1980s during this period, a music quality began to be seen. During this period, the first rock festival of the Soviet Union, Rhythms of Spring, Tbilisi 80, also known as the Tbilisi Rock Festival, was held from the 8th to March 16, 1980. During this period, rock bands had the opportunity to reach a much larger audience thanks to the music program called Music Ring, broadcast on radio and television. These new developments enabled rock music to take on a new style in the Soviet Union. Many new musical trends emerged, especially in Leningrad. Many punk bands began to form during these years. In the 1980s, Soviet rock music encountered some difficulties. Between 1983 and 1985, rock bands other than Via encountered various difficulties. The first difficulty was that the Soviet government, under the influence of the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Konstantin Chernenko, declared that holding concerts without permission would bring profit in a capitalist manner and that this was a form of private property. For this reason, it was forbidden to hold concerts without permission, and some rock band members who insisted on giving concerts were even arrested. The second difficulty was that after rock music began to be enjoyed by large masses around the world in the 1980s, the USA began to use this music genre for propaganda purposes. The anti-Soviet propaganda of the Western music bands listened to by large masses increased gradually. The anti-communist rock movement emerged in England, and music groups took on an anti-communist, nationalist, and white supremacist stance. Komsomol organizations exposed the excesses of rock and metal bands that became famous in the West, which were incompatible with Soviet society. Soviet criticism of these bands varied. As you can see from the screen, there were many arguments that many groups used both in their lyrics and in their stage performances. You see examples of some well-known groups today. AC/DC Fascism and Violence, Alice Cooper Violence and Vandalism, Black Sabbath Reactionism and Violence. They were associated with many of these. During this period, although Western media outlets generally explained the issue with Soviet censorship, nationalism, racism, violence and anti-communism continued to be seen intensely in the lyrics and concert performances of the groups in question. In 1985, the Moscow Rock Laboratory Public Organization was established, which allowed Moscow groups to legalize their activities. With the policies of perestroika and glasnost, musicians had the opportunity to perform without being subject to criminal prosecution, and rock music would survive until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the last years of the 1980s. In general, the 80s of Soviet rock history is similar to the late 1960s in Western countries. Many rock clubs were founded in Soviet cities, many well-known rock bands introduced themselves, the number of people writing articles about rock music increased, and rock festivals increased noticeably. By the late 1980s, the Soviet rock music market had generally emerged from the underground. Many films that became an integral part of Soviet rock culture were shot. Thief, shot in 1986, and Yaha, shot with the participation of rock bands, are examples of these films. Then Asa in 1987, Needle in 1988, and Taxi Blues in 1989 were important Soviet rock films. In addition, Soviet rock bands now had many opportunities to give concerts in other countries, record and release albums, and collaborate with foreign musicians. For example, in 1988 and 1989, the Soviet rock band Kino gave concerts in France, Italy, and Denmark. Another band, Zukimu, released an album in Great Britain and toured England and the USA. Aquarium leader Boris Grabenchkov recorded the English album Radio Silence with Dave Stewart in the USA. During these years, Soviet rock music opened up to the world and Soviet rock bands began to act worldwide. When the Soviet Union collapsed, rock bands in every Soviet country continued to reinvent their music in their own countries and formed the basis of many rock bands that are still known today. Yes, comrades, in this video I wanted to give you information about the history of rock music in the Soviet Union. I hope you liked it. This topic was generally little known, or as I said at the beginning of the video, it was known through lies. I hope the video was useful. Soviet Labili Ilgili OK side of video Lyorum. If you want to check out other topics, please visit our Soviet Journey channel and subscribe. See you again. Goodbye for now.